I'm going to tell you something that starts with a piece of information that will probably make you stop listening, but I need you to hear it anyway. My biological father is a Sasquatch, not metaphorically, not spiritually, genetically. He's a 7-foot-tall creature covered in dark brown hair that lives in the high country of Northern California, and I am his daughter. My name is Catherine Reeves. I'm 54 years old. I work as a wildlife biologist for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife out of the Redding office, and I have spent the last 30 years of my professional career studying predator ecology in regions where I was also growing up in the shadows of the very thing my official job told me didn't exist. The contradiction has become my life. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. I'm telling you this now because my mother is in hospice. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4, and the end is probably days away. She's asked me to do this one thing before she dies. She's asked me to say her name and her story out loud, while there's still time for me to explain it the way she would. She's asked me to put the lie to bed once and for all, and I'm doing it because she raised me alone in a cabin in Trinity County with a secret that she carried for 56 years, and she deserves to have that secret honored, not buried with her. I owe her that much. I owe her everything. My mother's name was Patricia Kessler. She was born in 1941 in Eureka, California, to a timber cruiser named Henry Kessler and a school teacher named Margaret Ann Foster. She grew up in Scotia, which was a company town owned by Pacific Lumber. Everything in Scotia belonged to the company. The houses were company houses. The store was a company store. The school was funded by company money. The hospital ran on company decisions. Even the radio station broadcast what the company wanted broadcast. Everything that happened in Scotia was filtered through the lens of what Pacific Lumber needed. Henry Kessler was a timber cruiser, which meant he spent his life in the forest, estimating timber value and marking trees for harvest. He'd be gone for days at a time, sometimes weeks. He'd disappear into the back country with a transit and a notebook and a crew, and he'd come back with information that determined which mountains would be cut next. Patricia would wait for him. She'd sit on the porch of the company house where they lived, and she'd watch the road, and when his truck appeared through the redwood tunnel, her whole body would relax. When Henry came home, he'd smell like diesel and cut wood and something wilder that Patricia couldn't name. Something earthy. Something that smelled like places that hadn't been touched yet. He'd sit in the living room and he'd drink coffee and he'd tell stories about the work, about the size of the trees, some of them 400 years old and 200 feet tall, about the difficulty of the terrain, the slopes that wanted to kill you, the ravines that went down and down and down, about strange movements he sometimes saw at dusk in the deep timber, animals that moved upright, shapes in the shadows at the edge of the crew's lighting, sounds that didn't have a name in any field guide. Margaret would tell him to hush. She'd tell him that she didn't want that kind of talk in the house. It wasn't practical. It wasn't useful. It didn't contribute anything productive to the family unit. Margaret had been raised to believe that reality was what could be measured and counted and documented. Everything else was superstition, and it had no place in a rational household. But Patricia listened. She listened while she did her homework. She listened while she helped her mother prepare dinner. She listened to every word her father said about the impossible things he'd seen. Patricia was quiet as a child. That's what everyone said about her. Not shy exactly. Quiet. She watched. She observed. She noticed patterns. By the time she was 7 years old, she could tell the difference between a Douglas fir and a grand fir by looking at the cone. By 10, she could identify 50 bird species by their calls alone. She kept a notebook where she recorded her observations, weather patterns, plant phenology, the migration timing of different species. Her teachers said she was bright, but something about her made them uncomfortable. There was an intensity to the way she looked at the world. When Patricia was 17, in the summer of 1958, she applied for a job with the Forest Service, not in the office, in the field. They hired teenagers sometimes to do trail maintenance and fire prevention work in the back country. It was hard work, and it was lonely, and it was exactly what Patricia wanted. She wanted to be away from Scotia, away from the compressed reality of a company town, away from the expectations of what a young woman was supposed to want. She was assigned to work the eastern face of the Trinity Alps, the high country around Stuart Fork, and the granite peaks that rose above 10,000 feet. Remote doesn't begin to describe it. The nearest road was hours away. The nearest ranger station was a full day's hike. You could walk 6 miles in any direction and see no human evidence at all. No trails marked for civilians. No names on the peaks except the ones on topographic maps that only surveyors looked at. Just timber and granite and waterfalls and the slow-moving clouds that came up from the valley in the afternoons and burned off in the morning light. The crew was small, maybe 8 people, mostly teenagers and a few older guys who worked the summery season to stay in shape for the difficult work in fall. They'd get dropped off at a central location each morning and split into teams of 2. Patricia was paired with a girl named Linda for the first 2 weeks. Linda was pretty in the way that teenage girls in town were pretty, and she was also miserable in the mountains. She complained about her feet. She complained about the elevation. She cried when she got bored or tired. When the crew leader noticed that Patricia and Linda weren't getting much accomplished, he reassigned Linda to help the cook and gave Patricia a full section of trail to work alone. A full section meant roughly 4 miles of maintained pathway through dense forest and across talus slopes that shifted under your feet and over granite ridges where the wind came down from the high country with real force. The crew would file her route each morning, and she'd head out with a map and a machete and a spray can of marking paint. She'd return to the pickup point by evening. Between those 2 moments, she was utterly alone. She loved it. The solitude, the work that had a clear beginning and end, the knowledge that she was the only person in that landscape, and that if she disappeared, no one would know where to look. She'd cut deadfall from the trail. She'd mark junctions where routes split. She'd look for fire damage from the previous season. She'd move through the forest, and she'd feel like she was part of something, not controlled, not managed, something real. It was late August when the light in the forest shifted toward autumn. The afternoons were getting shorter. The nights were getting cold. Patricia had covered most of her assigned section, and she was working on the upper elevation part of the trail, where it crossed granite talus and wound through stunted whitebark pines. The trees up there were small and twisted from the wind and the rocky soil. The sky was enormous. She came around a granite outcrop at about 9,000 feet, and she saw him standing on the ridge maybe 200 yards away. The first thing she felt wasn't fear. It was a kind of recognition that moved through her body before her mind caught up with it, like she was seeing something she'd been waiting for her whole life, without knowing she was waiting. Like all of her, had been oriented toward this moment, and now the moment had arrived. He was tall, probably 10 feet, maybe 11, with dark brown fur that had a sheen to it, like it was woven from light and shadow. His shoulders were massive, broader than any animal she'd ever seen or even imagined. His head was narrower than a bear's, with small rounded ears that seemed almost delicate compared to the rest of his body. He was standing upright on two legs, watching her, looking at her directly. They looked at each other for maybe a minute. Her heart was hammering. Her hands had gone cold, despite the warmth of the day. The wind was moving across the ridge, and she could see his fur moving in it like something alive and separate from his body. And then he turned and walked back into the rocks and disappeared. Patricia stood there for probably 10 minutes, shaking, convinced she'd hallucinated something brought on by altitude and heat and too many hours alone in the mountains. But when she got her legs to work again and made it back to the pickup point, the first thing she did was check her route against her notes. She'd covered the exact distance she was supposed to cover. Everything about the day was normal except for the one moment where she'd seen something that shouldn't exist. She didn't tell anyone. She knew if she reported it, the story would move faster than a brush fire through the crew and through the ranger station, and people would come looking. People with guns and agendas. People who saw unusual creatures as problems to be solved. And he would not survive that. So she kept it to herself. She finished her section of trail. She went to the evening meal with the rest of the crew. She sat through the cook's stories about her difficult teenage years. She slept in the crew tent listening to Linda snore quietly nearby. And she planned. 3 days later, she filed a route that took her near that same location. She didn't deviate enough to make it obvious to anyone monitoring the maps. Just close enough. And when the crew dispersed that morning, she hiked to that granite outcrop, and she sat down, and she waited. The afternoon light was moving across the peaks, creating shadows that shifted and changed. An eagle moved in a wide circle overhead, riding the thermals that came up from the valley. Birds called to each other across the granite. The wind moved through the stunted pines. And then she heard him before she saw him. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming down from the high ground, from the rocks that were too steep and too exposed for her to climb. He came from above, moving down the slope toward her. He was moving carefully, she realized, deliberately making himself smaller, less threatening. When he was about 30 feet away, he stopped. He settled back on his haunches, crouching, bringing his massive height down toward her level. And they looked at each other again, this time for longer, maybe 10 minutes. Patricia didn't move. She barely breathed, and neither did he. Just two creatures in the same space, looking at each other, being known by the other. Quick thing before we get into it. A lot of what I've learned about Bigfoot doesn't fit into these videos.
Quick thing before we get into it. I have a book coming out. It's called the Bigfoot Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. It's kind of my baby. So if you want to check it out, links down below. And let's get you back to the video.
A journal. She was meticulous about keeping records. She'd studied forestry at Humboldt State, and she understood the value of documentation. She recorded weather patterns, temperature, wind direction. She documented plant species, noting which ones were flowering and which ones were dormant. She recorded trail conditions and deadfall quantity. She marked everything down in her careful handwriting. Every observation categorized and dated and time-stamped. After that day with him on the ridge, she added another column to her observations. The date, the time of day, the location coordinates as close as she could estimate them, a detailed description, and her own response. In that first entry, she wrote in her careful script, "The creature was approximately 10 feet tall, covered in dark brown fur with a sheen, with hands that looked almost human and eyes that were aware and intelligent. I felt recognized. I felt connected to something I don't have words for yet, and I think I'm going back tomorrow. She went back 7 times over the remaining 3 weeks of the summer. Every time she walked to that location, he was there. Every time he appeared, he let her get closer. By the 4th visit, she was sitting maybe 15 feet away. By the 6th visit, she was 10 feet away. She could see the texture of his fur. She could see the individual hairs on his arms and the scars across his shoulders, where something had slashed him years ago. By the 7th visit, the last time before the Forest Service contract ended and she had to leave the mountains, they were close enough that she could see the complex structure of his hands. His hands were what she kept returning to in her journal entries. They were enormous, that was the first thing. Padded palms, easily twice the size of her own, with a texture that looked almost leathery. Fingers that were longer than human fingers, with joints in slightly different positions. The proportions were wrong for a human, but they weren't paws either. They were something in between, nails that were dark and curved and sharp-looking. But they weren't claws, not exactly. They were something that suggested both power and dexterity, the ability to tear and the ability to manipulate, the ability to be both weapon and tool. And on that last meeting, when she felt brave enough, when the pull between them had become something she couldn't deny, when she raised her hand slowly and he raised his, when they moved toward each other in that clearing at 9,000 feet, with the mountains spread out below them and the sky enormous overhead, she realized his massive hand was trembling. She could see it, the smallest vibration in his fingers. A 7-foot-tall creature with the strength to snap her bones with one motion, and his hand was shaking. She didn't touch him that time. She was too scared. She was 21 years old, and she was looking at something that shouldn't exist, according to every field guide and scientific paper she'd read. Everything in her body was responding to it. Everything in her was being pulled toward him, and she couldn't reconcile the fear with the pull. The two things were happening simultaneously, and she didn't know what to do with that. So she pulled back, and she said something out loud. She said, "I'll come back. I promise I'll come back." And he made a sound, not a roar, not a growl, not an animal vocalizing, a low vocalization that came from deep in his chest. It was the first sound he'd ever made to her, and it resonated in the bones of her chest. It was almost like an answer, almost like acknowledgement, almost like a promise in return. She left the mountains when the contract ended in early September. The crew was transported back to the staging area where they were paid and thanked for their work. She said goodbye to the crew leader. She didn't tell anyone why she'd cried that last night in the tent. She took a bus back to Scotia. She went back to high school for her senior year. She graduated. She worked for a timber company's office for a while, entering data into ledgers, doing the clerical work that kept the industry moving. She was saving money. She had a boyfriend for a period, a logger named Robert from Fortuna, who was 5 years older and who smelled like the work he did. Robert wanted to marry her and have kids and settle into a normal life in a small town. Robert was a good man. He was patient with her. He didn't push, but Patricia couldn't give him what he needed because there was a piece of her that was in the mountains, and she didn't know how to get it back. The piece of her that had felt recognized, the piece that had seen what she was looking for. She couldn't leave that behind, and she couldn't bring Robert with her into it. So she ended it. She was kind about it. She told him the truth as much as she could tell it, and Robert married someone else. The last she heard, he was living in Fortuna and had 3 kids and was working as a supervisor at a mill. He was probably happy, but Patricia knew she wasn't the person who could have made him happy. In 1963, 5 years after that first encounter, Patricia made a decision. She took the money she'd saved and she drove into Trinity County and she went looking for land. She wanted to be close to the high country where she'd seen him. She wanted to be positioned where she could go to the mountains easily. She wanted to build a life that was oriented toward watching for him. She found a property that was almost perfect, 20 acres in the back country, accessible by a rough county road that turned to gravel, that turned to dirt, that eventually went to nothing. A partially built cabin, started by someone who had run out of money or will or both. No electricity, no indoor plumbing, no well. Just a foundation and some walls and a partial roof. But the structure was sound, the foundation was level, and it was close to Stuart Fork, close to the high country where she'd seen him. She bought it, she moved in, and she spent the next 2 years finishing the cabin herself. She built walls using timber from a local mill and insulation that she bought with money from seasonal work for the Forest Service and clerical work for a lumber company in Trinity. She installed a metal roof during the dry season. She dug a well by hand, going down 10 feet into granite, hitting water at 10 feet 2 inches. She stocked the cabin with supplies. She created a life that was utterly simple and utterly aligned with what she needed. A place to wait. A place to be close to him. A place to be ready if he came. And in the spring of 1964, after she'd been settled in the cabin for almost a year, after she'd made the pilgrimage into the mountains a dozen times looking for him and finding nothing, she heard him in the forest behind the cabin. It was March. There was still snow at the higher elevations, and the nights were cold enough to frost the ground. She heard his movement through the trees. She heard the breaking of deadfall under his weight. She went outside with her heart hammering, and there he was in the starlight. She recognized him immediately, not just because it had been 5 years, but because there was a part of her that had always known him, that had been looking for him since the moment she was born. What happened next? What my mother told me happened next, what I'm now telling you happened next, is something that exists in a space between the animal and the human, and between what we think is possible and what actually occurs. It exists in a space that we don't have good language for. My mother did not resist him. She said every part of her was saying yes to him. She said when he was inside her, she felt like her skin was barely holding in everything she was. She said it was the most beautiful and terrifying thing she had ever experienced. I was conceived in that moment. A human woman and a creature that shouldn't exist, connected by something that had been pulling them toward each other since they first locked eyes in the mountains. They made a human offspring together. They made me. I was born 9 months later on a December night in 1964. My mother was alone in the cabin. No doctor, no midwife. No one but her and her knowledge that she had carried something inside her that didn't have a name and didn't have a place in any understanding of the world. She labored alone. She delivered alone. And when I came into the world, I was human enough to survive. I was human enough to require the things human babies require. But I was also something else. I don't have clear memories of the first years of my life. I have images, impressions, a sense of massive hands that were careful not to grip too hard. The smell of him. That's what I remember most vividly. A smell like pine and wet earth and something older and deeper, something musky and animal and comforting. something that made my animal brain recognize him as family, even when my human brain didn't have words for it yet. He came to the cabin regularly in those early years. My mother would hear him in the forest, and she'd take me outside, and we'd wait for him to emerge from the trees. He would hold me. His hand would cover most of my torso. He'd look at me with those amber eyes, and I felt no fear, only recognition. I was his daughter, and he knew me, and I knew him, even though I was too young to understand. I just felt loved. But as I got older, as I started to talk and think and develop the consciousness of a human child, he came less frequently. My mother said later that she thought he was making space for me, that he understood at some level that I needed to be raised by my mother's kind, not his, that I needed to learn how to speak and think in ways that would let me move in the human world, that being part of him was already pulling me in a direction that she couldn't fully support, that any more of his presence would unbalance the scales. I was 3 years old when he stopped coming to the cabin. My mother didn't tell him goodbye. One evening she expected him and he didn't arrive. The next evening she waited and he didn't come. She checked the mountains. She looked for sign, and she realized he'd decided to leave, that he'd made the choice to step back from her and from me. She said she understood. She said she'd known it was coming, but she also said that she felt it in her body the moment he decided to leave, a pressure releasing in her chest, a weight settling onto her shoulders that would never fully lift. She built a life with me in that cabin. She homeschooled me using whatever materials she could get from the bookmobile that came through twice a month. She'd order books from the library in Reading. She'd trade with other homeschooling families. She taught me mathematics using her own notes and old textbooks. She taught me history using primary sources and books that told stories that went deeper than what high school curricula covered. She taught me biology by taking me into the forest and showing me things. She taught me how plants grew and how animals moved and how ecosystems balanced themselves. She also taught me that the things I could see and hear and smell were real, and that if the world told me they weren't real, the world was lying, not my eyes. That was maybe the most important thing she taught me, to trust my own perception, to know that my understanding of reality was valid even if it contradicted what everyone else said. She told me about my father. She didn't hide it. She explained that he was different from most people, that he was stronger, and he moved differently, and he had ways of seeing the world that humans didn't have access to. She told me that I was half of what he was, and half of what she was, that I could never be fully one thing or the other, that I would always be standing between two worlds, and that was okay, that was actually a gift, if I could learn to see it that way. She also told me that there were others, that my father's kind existed in the mountains, and that they had names and territories and ways of knowing that we didn't have access to. She told me that there were 9 of them living in the high country between Trinity County and Shasta County, a small family group. The dominant male, the females, the juveniles who would eventually become adults, and one elder who had been in those mountains for longer than anyone could track. She drew maps. She showed me the territories she'd identified. She told me the stories of each one as she understood them. The big male, who had a scar across his shoulder from a territorial dispute years ago. The female who moved through the Northern Territory and who had given birth to twins 1 year. The juvenile who was learning to hunt. The elder who seemed to oversee the movements of the whole group. She took notes. She kept records. She maintained a running count. She documented every sighting, every piece of evidence, every pattern she identified. I was 12 years old when she first took me, intentionally, to see one. Not to hide and observe from a distance, to meet. We hiked into the high country in July, supposedly looking for rare alpine plant species for a project she'd created for my education. We spent 3 days in the granite landscape above Stuart Fork, moving higher each day. We stayed off trail. We moved through territory that few humans had ever entered. On the second night, we came to a clearing that was bounded by enormous rocks and stunted whitebark pines that had been twisted by decades of wind. She told me to sit. She told me to be very quiet, and she told me that we were going to wait. She didn't tell me what we were waiting for, but I knew. Part of me had always known. We waited through the night and into the morning. Nothing came. We waited through the afternoon and into the evening. The light was fading, and I was starting to think nothing was going to happen. And then he came. The creature she called the big male. The one whose territory seemed to overlap with the area where my father had come to her. He was enormous, taller than my father had been in the photograph she'd kept hidden in her drawer. Probably 9 feet tall, scarred. One of his ears was torn at the top, a V-shaped notch that she said he'd gotten in a territorial dispute with another male years ago. But his eyes were bright, alert, focused. He looked at me and I felt it. That same click of recognition that my mother had felt at 17. That feeling of being known. He didn't approach us. He stayed at the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 feet away. He looked at me for what felt like a very long time. And then he seemed to nod, a slow dip of his enormous head. And he faded back into the rocks and the trees. And he was gone. My mother said, "That's your family. That's the people you come from. They're still here. They're still alive in these mountains. And you need to remember that. Not in anger, not in fear, but in knowledge. You are here because of love. You are here because two impossible things decided to love each other anyway." The years after that were different. I started noticing the ways that I was different from other people. I was taller than kids my age, even at 12. I became stronger as I grew. I could see better in dim light. My eyes adapted to darkness in ways that seemed to happen faster than they should. I could hear frequencies of sound that seemed to make other people uncomfortable. I could smell things that had no obvious scent to everyone else. Emotions, perhaps. Pheromones. Things that moved through the air invisibly. By the time I was in high school, by the time I was at Fortuna High School in a classroom with 50 other teenagers, I could feel the pressure of other people's consciousness on me like a weight. I could sense their intentions toward me, and some of them sensed something in me that made them deeply uneasy. I got in fights, not often, but when it happened fast. Other kids would push, and I would respond, and I would win those fights in ways that scared people. I had strength I didn't know how to control. I had speed. I had reaction time that seemed impossible. Once a kid named Derek knocked another kid down in the hallway, and I was across the space before anyone could even register that I'd moved. My hands were around Derek's throat before my conscious mind caught up with what my body was doing. He survived. He had bruises. The school suspended me for a week. My mother didn't punish me. She just told me to learn to make myself smaller, to hide what was in me, to be more human than I was. It was survival. It was also loss. Every time I pushed down what I was, every time I made myself smaller, I was saying no to something inside me. My mother got sick when I was 24 years old. I was in graduate school at UC Davis studying biology. I got a call from the clinic in Trinity County. telling me that she had lung cancer. Stage 2. She'd never smoked. She'd lived in a cabin with a wood stove for most of her life, and she'd spent years and years breathing smoke. Grief does things to your body. I think she'd carried so much grief in her lungs from watching the creatures die out, from watching territories shrink, from witnessing loss that she couldn't stop or even slow down. She survived 5 years of treatment and lifestyle change and surgery and sheer stubborn will. She lived. And in that survival, she became more visible in the world. She started publishing papers about predator ecology under her own name. She took a position as a field consultant for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. She gave talks at universities about wildlife behavior and territorial marking. And she never once mentioned the creatures directly. But she positioned herself where she could protect them, where she could make sure that certain territories stayed protected, where she could use her scientific credibility to keep humans out of specific regions. I did the same thing, though I didn't fully know it at the time. I went to UC Davis. I studied biology and ecology. I got my doctorate focusing on large predator populations in the Sierra Nevada range. And I did it all knowing that I was studying family, that every paper I read about scat analysis and movement patterns and territorial behavior, I was reading about the creatures I came from, that every map I made was a map of their world. I got a job with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and I was assigned to the Redding office, which put me close enough to the Trinity Range that I could still work in the high country regularly. Not constantly, but regularly enough that I could see what was happening, that I could count, that I could keep a record. My professional work was about understanding mountain lion populations, how their ranges overlapped with human activity, where conflicts were most likely to occur, what management interventions were most effective. It was all technically accurate. It was also carefully positioned to protect the creatures. Every study I did placed protection zones in areas that were important Sasquatch territory. Every paper I published about predator ecology included enough data to suggest that certain regions needed to remain absolutely undisturbed. I had a daughter when I was 38. Her father was a wildlife photographer named David, who I dated for 2 years. He was good to me. He loved me. But ultimately, I couldn't give him everything a partner deserves because there was always a part of me that belonged somewhere else. In the forest, in the wild, with the creatures and the mountains and the knowledge that I was sitting on. We parted ways when I was pregnant. It was amicable. We both understood that it wasn't going to work. David is involved in his daughter's life. She spends summers with him. Her name is Eleanor. She's 17 now. And she's starting to notice things about herself that don't fit the standard narrative. Things she inherited that she doesn't have a name for yet. I haven't told her the full story. I'm not sure she's ready. But my mother asked me to start preparing her. She said the knowledge needs to pass down, that it's a responsibility and a gift and something that requires a specific kind of person to carry it. My mother retired 15 years ago when she was in her 70s. She went back to the cabin and she settled in, and she began the work of her final years. Waiting, watching, documenting everything she witnessed. She created detailed journals. She made maps with coordinates. She recorded sighting locations on GPS units that she'd learned to use despite her resistance to technology. And she discovered that the 9 had become 7, then 6. She found a juvenile dead in a ravine in 2003, killed by a car on Highway 299. The creature had been crossing the road at night and had been hit by a truck driver who probably didn't even know what he'd hit. She brought me the remains. There was enough to identify it as juvenile, maybe 3 or 4 years old, not yet fully grown. She found evidence of gunshots in the high country, spent casings, bullet holes in trees. She found evidence of traps set by hunters who didn't know what they were hunting, but who had decided that anything large and unknown was worth trying to kill. She found signs of the creatures being pushed higher and higher into the mountains as human pressure increased, trails being developed, private land being purchased and developed, the spaces where they could move freely shrinking every year. It broke her. I could see it. She kept working. She kept documenting. But something inside her was breaking. She was watching her whole life's work, her whole reason for existing, slowly disappear. She wrote it all down in her journals. She made maps. She recorded sighting coordinates. She documented behavior patterns. She kept a running count. She maintained notes about each individual creature, the marks that distinguished them, the territory each one covered, the changes she saw over time. And when she realized that she was running out of time, when the cancer came back and the doctors said there wasn't much they could do, she sat down and she figured out what needed to happen next. She figured out that she needed to tell someone, that the knowledge couldn't die with her, that I needed to become the keeper of the count, that I needed to understand the full weight of what I carried. She asked me to do this, to put the story into the world. Not all of it, not enough to endanger them, not specific locations or detailed identification, but enough for people to know that they exist. Enough for the people who love wilderness to understand that wilderness isn't empty. It's inhabited, it has people, it has families, it has cultures and ways of knowing that we have no language for yet. I've been sitting with that decision for a while. And my mother is now at the end. She's in hospice in Redding. She moves in and out of consciousness. The morphine has her mostly asleep. But when she's awake, she asks me if I've done it yet. If I've told the story, if I've said her name. I'm saying it now. Patricia Kessler. That was her name. That was her whole life. A woman who loved something impossible and built her entire existence around protecting it. She never married. She never had any other children. She never pursued anything that would have taken her away from that work. There are 9 of them left in the high country of Northern California. I have seen 7 of them. I have documented 4 on trail cameras over the years. I have scat samples and behavioral documentation. I have recordings of vocalizations that I've kept completely separate from my official work. And I have also seen them watch me with awareness that goes beyond animal instinct. I have seen them recognize me. I have seen them choose not to harm humans when they could have easily done so. I have seen them mourn. My mother told me about a female who had lost her offspring, and how the whole group had gone quiet for days afterward, how their vocalizations changed, how they moved differently through the territory. She said grief moves through their populations the way it moves through ours. My father is almost certainly dead by now. He was full grown when I was born in 1964. It's now 2018. That's 54 years. Creatures that size, if they're lucky, if they avoid humans and accidents and disease, live to 60 or 70. He's probably passed. But there are others. There are juveniles who will become adults. There are females who might have offspring. There's a population that's hanging on by a thread in the places we've decided to call protected wilderness, but which we're destroying anyway. One development permit at a time. My daughter is 17 now. She's taller than I am, which is unusual, and stronger, and she moves through the world with a kind of confidence that makes me nervous for her. She doesn't fully understand what she is yet, but she's beginning to ask questions. She wants to know why she can see in the dark, and why she's so much stronger than her friends, and why she has such an intense reaction to the wilderness. I haven't shown her all the documentation or the trail camera video from 1998. But I've started preparing her to trust her perceptions and understand that she comes from something wild. My mother is breathing more slowly now. The morphine has her mostly asleep. But sometimes she wakes and she asks me if I've done it, if I've said the story, if I've honored her by telling the world that she was brave, that she was one of the most courageous people I've ever known, that she lived her entire life in service to something that couldn't be named and that nobody understood. I'm doing it now. I'm doing it for her. I'm saying that my father was a Sasquatch, and my mother loved him, and I am the evidence of that love. And I am saying that the creatures are real, and I am saying that we need to change how we treat the wild places where they still exist. The mountains of Northern California are not empty. They are inhabited. They have families. They have grief. They have joy. They have systems and structures and ways of being that we have no language for. Every time we destroy a ridge or a forest or a watershed, we are destroying a world. We are making a choice. I'm making a different choice. I'm choosing to acknowledge, to witness, to say that they were here and they are still here and they matter, to say that my father was real, to say that my mother was brave, to say that the space between human and animal is not as wide as we think. My mother's breathing has become more shallow. I can see her chest moving less with each breath. The hospice nurse said it could be hours or it could be longer. Nobody can predict these things. But I need to go sit with her. I need to be there. But I wanted to tell this first. I wanted to honor what she asked me to do. So here's what I want you to know. This is real. Everything I've said is true. I cannot make you believe it, but I can ask you to sit with the possibility that the world is stranger and more beautiful and more inhabited than you thought. I can ask you to consider the places you think are empty and ask yourself whether they might be full of a kind of life you just haven't learned to recognize yet. My mother believed, and because she believed, something wild stayed alive. That's the power we all have. That's what I want you to know. That belief matters. That love matters. That choosing to see the truth even when it's impossible and difficult and requires you to exist in a space that doesn't make sense to anyone else matters. I'll end with this. If you've listened this far, if you've sat with this story, I want you to do one thing. Go outside tonight. Listen to the dark. Feel the presence of all the things that are there when we're not looking. And ask yourself whether the world is really as small as you thought it was. Ask yourself whether there might be room for mystery, for creatures we don't understand, for love that bridges species and comprehension. My mother believed. And because she believed, something wild stayed alive. That's what I'm saying. That's what she wanted the world to know. And now the world knows Catherine's work. The double life. When I started at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, I thought I could compartmentalize. I thought I could do legitimate predator ecology research during the day and protect my family during my off hours. But it turned out the best way to protect them was to make myself indispensable to the protection work. To position myself where I had authority and access. My doctoral research had focused on mountain lion populations in the Sierra Nevada. I'd spent 4 years studying territories, movement patterns, predation events, scat analysis, everything that could be documented and measured. I had published papers. I had peer-reviewed data. I was credible, and I used that credibility systematically. Every research proposal I submitted to CDFW positioned protection zones in areas where my mother had identified Sasquatch territories. I framed it in terms of mountain lion conservation. I would say that certain regions needed to remain undisturbed for breeding populations. I would cite population viability analysis papers showing that large predators required large territories with minimal human incursion. Everything I said was technically accurate. It was also designed to keep people out of the places where the creatures lived. I installed trail cameras throughout the high country. Officially, they were monitoring mountain lions. Unofficially, I was documenting Sasquatch movement patterns. I would go into the field and pretend to be collecting scat samples for mountain lion DNA analysis, but I was also collecting Sasquatch scat. I'd send the mountain lion samples to the lab, the other samples I kept. I learned scat analysis the way most biologists do. You identify it by size, shape, content, location. Sasquatch scat is distinctive. It's larger than bear scat. The segmentation pattern is different. The content reflects omnivory with heavy plant matter. I documented this in private notes that I never submitted to any official channel. My mother taught me the territories. She'd spent decades watching and recording. She had maps that showed me everything. The Big Male's territory covered roughly 40 square miles in the high country around Stuart Fork and the Granite Peaks. The females had overlapping territories that were smaller, but that shifted seasonally. The juveniles stayed close to their mothers. The elder male moved through all the territories, apparently with deference from the others. She told me about the losses. In 1989, a juvenile male disappeared. She found evidence suggesting he'd been hit by a car on Highway 299. In 1992, another juvenile was found dead in a ravine with bullet wounds. 2003, the one I mentioned, hit by a truck. 2007, a female vanished entirely. No body, no signs, just gone. 2010, another juvenile. The count went from 9 down to 6. By the time my mother retired, she was documenting the slow extinction of the only family group she'd ever known. It broke something in her, and it made me understand what my job actually was. It wasn't to publish papers about mountain lion ecology. It was to create a protected space, to use my position and my credibility and my access to make sure that what was left of them could survive. I became ruthless about it. I would identify areas that needed protection, and I would find the ecological justification. If a developer wanted to log a certain ridge, I would suddenly discover that the ridge was critical mountain lion habitat. If a mining company wanted to explore a drainage, I would find evidence of an endangered plant species that happened to be located exactly where the Sasquatch needed to move through safely. I wasn't making things up. The ecosystems were actually fragile. The mountain lions actually needed the protection. But I was leveraging real ecological principles in service of an agenda that nobody else understood. I was using my professional authority to protect creatures that my employers didn't believe existed. It worked. Over 20 years, I managed to get roughly 150 square miles of high-quality habitat, either protected as wilderness or placed under conservation easements. I worked with the Nature Conservancy. I worked with the Sierra Club. I worked with state agencies. I positioned myself as an expert on large predator conservation, and people listened to me because my data was solid and my publications were peer-reviewed. And underneath all of it, I was protecting my family. Eleanor's awakening. My daughter started noticing things when she was about 13. She came to me one afternoon and asked why she could see in the dark better than her friends, why she was so much stronger than kids her own age, why certain foods made her sick in ways that didn't make sense medically. I didn't tell her everything. I wasn't ready. But I started preparing her. I started teaching her the same way my mother taught me. I took her into the forest. I showed her how to move quietly. I taught her to trust her perceptions. I told her that she was special and that there were reasons for that which she would understand eventually. She was frustrated with me. She wanted answers, and I was giving her riddles. But Eleanor wasn't ready. She was too young. She still wanted to be like everyone else. High school was harder for her than it was for me, which surprised me. I thought my experiences would have prepared me to help her navigate the alienation of being different. But she was different in ways that were harder to hide. She was taller than other girls. She moved with a kind of grace that made people uncomfortable. Other girls seemed to sense something about her that they didn't like. I watched her try to make herself smaller, to hide her strength, to pretend to be confused by things she clearly understood. I watched her do what I'd done, and I hated it. But I also couldn't stop her. You can't protect people from the cost of existing in a world that wasn't made for them. She's 17 now, and she's starting to ask harder questions. She wants to know why her father and I didn't work out. She wants to know why I'm always gone during certain times of year. She wants to know why I have boxes of field equipment in the garage, and why I spend my nights looking at photographs on my computer. I think she's close to figuring it out, and I think she's ready to know. My mother certainly thinks she is. She said to me, "Catherine, Eleanor is old enough. She needs to understand what she is before someone else tells her in a way that damages her. Let her know that there's a reason for everything about her that feels wrong. Let her know that she comes from something wild and something true. I'm planning to tell her everything after my mother dies, when she's ready to hear it. When I'm ready to explain it. She deserves to know that she comes from a line of women who loved impossible things. That she comes from creatures who live in the mountains and who move through the world with grace and power. That there's nothing wrong with her. There's just something more. The count becomes personal. My mother kept meticulous records. She had a database that she maintained on an old computer that she'd learned to use reluctantly. She had GPS coordinates for every sighting. She had dates. She had photographs. She had behavioral notes. Over 40 years, she accumulated a record of a population in decline. The 9 that she documented in 1984 became 7 by 2000, became 6 by 2010, became 5 by 2015. The last confirmed sighting of the 6th individual was in 2018. A juvenile, probably female, moving through the high country in July. My mother got photographs. The images are grainy and the creature is mostly obscured by trees, but it's unmistakably there. Moving on 2 legs, massive shoulders, a head shape that's wrong for any animal in the field guides. That was 6 years ago. I haven't seen evidence of that individual since. Neither has my mother. We both suspect she's gone. Hit by a vehicle, killed by a hunter who didn't know what he was shooting at, dead from disease or injury in some ravine where she'll never be found. So the count is 5 now. I've documented 4 of them myself. I have photographs, I have scat samples, I have behavioral documentation. I've watched 2 of them interact with each other. I've heard their vocalizations recorded on audio equipment I installed specifically to capture their presence. One of them is the big male that my mother has been watching for 40 years. He's old now. His movements are slower. His fur is graying, but he still moves through the territory with authority. I saw him 3 months ago in the high country above Stuart Fork. He was moving slowly through a talus field, stopping frequently to look at the mountains. He looked tired. He looked like he was carrying the weight of everything his kind has lost. I thought about approaching him. My mother asked me to. She said, "Catherine, go talk to him. Tell him that someone knows he exists. Tell him that someone has been documenting his life and his family and his territory for 50 years. Tell him that he's not invisible." But I didn't. I watched him from a distance. I photographed him. I recorded the sound of his movement. And I let him move on, deeper into the mountains, back into the places where he could be safe. That's what all of this is really about. Safety. Creating the space for them to exist without human interference. My mother understood that her whole life, and she transferred that understanding to me. And I'm going to transfer it to Eleanor. The documentation project. My mother created something before she got sick. She called it the Trinity Record. It's a comprehensive document that includes everything she learned about the Sasquatch population in the high country. She has the history of each individual. She has their territories. She has behavioral patterns. She has records of every interaction she witnessed. She has notes about their vocalizations and their social structure. She has her hypothesis about how they organize themselves and how they make decisions. Some of it is speculative. My mother was a scientist, but she was also a human being living alone in the mountains for 60 years. She developed theories that went beyond what the data could support. She believed that the creatures had a culture, that they had traditions, that they passed knowledge from generation to generation, that they mourned their dead, that they had naming systems, and that they used them to identify individuals. I don't know if she was right about all of that. But I know that what she observed was real, and I know that the creatures recognize each other. I know that they interact. I know that they have relationships. She also documented something that she never fully explained to me. She said that there were signs that the creatures understood they were being watched, that they left markers, that they communicated with her in ways that went beyond simple animal behavior. She found arrangements of stones in specific patterns. She found broken branches that seemed to be marked deliberately. She found evidence of intentional placement rather than random natural occurrence. She believed that the eldest male was aware of her presence in the mountains, that he knew she was there, that he had decided to let her be there, that they had reached an understanding about coexistence. I read her notes, and I tried to determine whether she was correct or whether 60 years of isolation had altered her perception. But then I started noticing the same things. I found arrangements of stones. I found markers that seemed deliberate. I found evidence of intentional communication. I don't know what it means, but something is happening that suggests awareness and intention. That's what I'll devote my career to understanding, how the creatures communicate and what they want us to know. The vigil begins. My mother started declining rapidly about 3 months ago. The cancer spread to her liver, then to her bones. She lost weight. She lost appetite. She lost the ability to do the things that had given her life meaning. She couldn't hike anymore. She couldn't spend days in the mountains. She couldn't maintain her physical presence in the territories. But she could still think. She could still remember. She could still document. She dictated notes to me. She told me stories about individual creatures. She told me about interactions she'd witnessed. She told me about moments when she felt certain that they understood her. that they were communicating with her intentionally. She told me about a time in 1996 when she was sick with pneumonia and couldn't leave the cabin. She said the female brought her a deer, not a fresh kill, a dressed deer, with the organs removed and the hide still attached. The female left it on the porch and then disappeared back into the forest. My mother said it was a gift. She said it was food. She said it was a gesture of care. She said the female was taking care of her, the way the female would take care of her own family. She said it meant that they knew her, that they saw her as part of their world. I didn't know whether to believe her, but I asked myself, what would it mean if she was right? What would it mean if the creatures understood that she was there, and that she was alone, and that she was struggling? What would it mean if they responded to that understanding with care? It would mean they're not animals in the way we understand animals. It would mean they're people. It would mean my mother was living in relationship with another sentient species for 60 years, and nobody knew about it. The cabin years, building a life in secret. When my mother bought the property in 1963, it was raw land with a skeleton of a cabin, no finish, no insulation, no real roof. She saw opportunity, a place she could create without anyone watching, without anyone knowing what she was building toward. The first year, she installed a proper roof using corrugated metal panels from a Trinity supplier. The roofing took 3 weeks of dawn to dusk work. She went into town weekly for supplies. Nobody asked questions. It was 1963. She dug the well that year. A county driller found water at 10 feet. She paid him and dug the rest herself. Well, digging is brutal work, but my mother was relentless. She was building a home for herself and for the thing she loved. The second year, she built the walls and insulation, bought lumber, installed studs, fitted drywall herself. By 1964, the cabin was livable. A simple 700-square-foot structure with main room, bedroom, storage, and bathroom. Minimal. Functional. Perfect. She lived there alone for a full year before my father came to her. A year of waiting, a year of learning the mountains, a year of familiarizing herself with the territory and the patterns and the creatures that moved through it. She would hike every day. She would sit and observe. She would listen. She was preparing herself for something she didn't fully understand. And then he came to her, that March night in 1964. And everything changed. I don't clearly remember the cabin from my earliest years. Mostly images, the smell of wood smoke, the sound of wind, being held in enormous hands. We lived simply. No electricity, kerosene lamps, wood stove, outhouse. It was a life of complete independence, dependent only on what the land provided. She taught me to hunt when I was 10. We started with rabbits, learning to move silently, position downwind, kill quickly and humanely. By 12, I was hunting deer with her. She moved with grace that came from decades of practice in that territory. We never used guns. We used bows. My mother made bows from wood that she selected and crafted herself. She taught me to make my own bow, to understand the wood, to understand the tension, to understand the balance between string and wood, and the energy that would propel an arrow toward a target. It was craftsmanship. It was meditation. It was a way of existing in the world that required presence and attention. The venison that we killed, we used everything. We made jerky. We made stews. We made bone broth that we used for soup. We tanned the hides for clothing and bedding. We used the sinew for thread. Nothing was wasted. Everything was honored. My mother talked about the creatures sometimes when we were working. Not often, but sometimes. She would say things like, They hunt the same way you hunt, Catherine. They move through the territory, and they notice everything. They understand where things are. They understand the patterns. She said, you have that in you. You understand the land because you come from them. Learn to trust that part of yourself. I didn't fully understand what she meant at the time, but I was learning it anyway. I was learning to move, to notice, to understand patterns, to exist in relationship with the landscape rather than in opposition to it. Everything I learned from my mother was preparing me to move through a world that most people didn't even know existed. Catherine's first official sighting, I was 26 years old when I saw one alone for the first time since I was 3. I was doing my doctoral research. I had come home to the cabin for the summer to do field work. I was setting up a series of trail cameras in the high country. Officially, I was monitoring mountain lion movement. Unofficially, I was looking for my family. It was a clear day in July. I had hiked into the granite country above Stuart Fork with my camera equipment and my maps. My mother had marked certain locations that she thought would be good for documentation. I was installing a camera when I heard movement in the rocks above me. I froze, not in fear, in attention. Something large was moving through the rocks, something that didn't sound like a bear or an elk. The movement was too deliberate, too controlled. I turned slowly, and there he was, standing maybe 50 yards away on a high rock, the big male, the one my mother had been watching for decades. He was enormous, probably 9 feet tall. Scarred, his fur was dark brown, almost black in some places. His shoulders were massive. He looked at me, and I felt that same thing again, that sense of recognition, that feeling of being seen by something that understood me. He didn't approach. He just stood there, looking, for maybe a minute. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing back into the rocks as if he'd never been there at all. I stood there shaking for probably 5 minutes. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the camera. But I managed to check the memory card. I had footage, 30 seconds of him standing on the rock. 30 seconds of proof that he existed. I went back to my mother that evening and I told her what I'd seen. She smiled. She said, "He wanted you to know he was there. He wanted you to see him. He's been curious about you since you were born." She said, "You need to accept that you belong to 2 worlds, and both of them are looking at you, waiting to see which one you choose." I didn't choose for many years after that. I went to grad school. I got my doctorate. I built my career. I published papers and established myself as an expert on large predator ecology. I did all of that while carrying the knowledge that the most important predator in those mountains was something I was related to, something I could speak to if I wanted to, something that recognized me as kin. The second encounter. I was 32 years old when I saw one again. I was working as a field biologist for CDFW by then. I had established myself professionally. I had credentials. I had authority. I was using that authority to protect the mountains where they lived. I was doing a survey in the high country above Stuart Fork in August. I was alone. I had permits for all my work. I had explained to my supervisor that I was studying mountain lion territories and that I needed to spend extended time in the field to get accurate movement data. He'd approved it. He didn't know that I was also documenting Sasquatch presence. I was sitting above a clearing at dusk. I was watching, waiting. This was a location that my mother had identified as a place where multiple creatures sometimes gathered. Not often, but occasionally. usually in late summer or early fall. I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, a female. She was smaller than the males, maybe 7 feet tall, slim, dark brown fur. She came out of the trees, and she crossed the clearing, and she sat down like she was making an appointment, like she knew I was watching. She stayed for maybe 20 minutes. She looked around. She looked at where I was sitting, though I don't think she could see me in the dusk, and then she got up, and she walked back into the trees, and she was gone. I documented it all. I had a camera with a telephoto lens. I got photographs. I got video. I had audio recording equipment. I captured her vocalizations. I documented evidence that was, to my eye at least, absolutely conclusive proof that these creatures existed. But I couldn't do anything with that evidence. I couldn't submit it to my employer. I couldn't publish it. I couldn't use it to advance my career. I had to keep it private. I had to keep it secret. I had to file it away with all the other evidence that I was sitting on. All the documentation that nobody could ever see. That was when I truly understood what my mother had spent her whole life doing. She wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone else. She was creating a record. She was bearing witness. She was saying, I see you. I know you exist. I am documenting your life so that your existence is not forgotten, even if nobody else ever believes in it. That's what I've been doing for the last 22 years, creating a record, bearing witness, saying to these creatures, I know you're here. I know you're real. I know what you are. The losses, my mother kept a list. It was separate from her other documentation. It was titled simply, The Ones We Lost. She recorded the date that each creature disappeared or died. She recorded what evidence she had about how they died. She recorded what she thought their loss meant for the population. 1989, June, male juvenile, motor vehicle collision on Highway 299, hit by a truck driver who didn't report it. She found the body 3 days later in the ravine below the road. She buried him there. She performed a kind of funeral. She sat with his body and she cried. 1992, April, male juvenile, gunshot wound, caliber unclear from the bullet wound but consistent with a high-powered rifle. She found the body in a meadow in the high country. Whoever shot him left him there, left him to rot. She buried him, too. She said words over his grave. 2003, November, female juvenile, motor vehicle collision, hit by a semi-truck on Highway 299 while crossing at night. The truck driver called it in. Forest Service went and retrieved the body. They labeled it unidentified wildlife. They cremated it. My mother grieved alone. 2007, August, adult female. Disappeared, no body found, no signs of violence. She just stopped appearing in the territories. My mother searched for months. She never found her. 2010, March, male juvenile, cause unknown. She found the body in a cave system in the high country. He was already decomposing. Disease, maybe. Injury, maybe. She couldn't determine the cause. She buried him in the cave where he was found. 2015. October, female juvenile, motor vehicle collision on Highway 299. Same road, same place. It seemed like that highway was a killing field. Like every year, another one would try to cross and another one would die. My mother documented all of these. She documented each loss. She documented her grief. And she kept going. She kept watching. She kept recording. She kept holding space for the ones who remained. By the time she got sick, there were only 5 of them left. 5 creatures remaining from the 9 that she'd documented in 1984. 5 from a population that had been stable for centuries and was now collapsing. Eleanor learns. I decided to tell Eleanor everything 3 months ago, before my mother got too sick to explain things herself, before the moment passed. My mother said that it was important that Eleanor hear it directly from both of us, that she understand her history, that she know where she came from. We sat together in my mother's cabin, the cabin that Patricia had built with her own hands, the cabin where I was born, the cabin that had been the center of everything. My mother told Eleanor the story. She started at the beginning with her 1958 encounter with my father. She told Eleanor that she had loved him, that she had built her entire life around protecting him and his family, that she had never regretted a single day of it. Eleanor listened. She cried. She asked questions. She wanted to know what my father looked like, what he sounded like, whether I actually remembered him or whether I was just remembering stories, whether Eleanor would get to meet him. I told her that he was almost certainly dead by now, that the creatures live a long time, but not forever, that he had probably passed many years ago, that I had gone to the high country hundreds of times since I was 3 years old, and I had never seen him again, that my mother believed he had made a deliberate choice to step back from our lives, to let me be human, to let us have our own path. Eleanor wanted to know if there were others, if she had siblings, if there was a whole family of half-Sasquatch children out there. I told her no, that as far as my mother and I knew, I was the only one, that my father had chosen only her, that for whatever reasons, he had decided that one human offspring was enough, that one daughter was all he would give to the world beyond his own kind. She asked what that meant for her, what her future would look like, whether she would be able to have a normal life, a normal family, normal experiences. I told her that there was no normal for someone like us, that being half of something that doesn't officially exist meant existing in a liminal space, a space between things, a space that was real but that nobody else could see. But I also told her that it was a gift, that it meant she had access to ways of knowing that other people didn't, that she could move through the world with abilities that other people didn't have, that she came from something ancient and wild and true. My mother said, "Eleanor, your grandmother loved your great-grandfather, even though he was something that the world told her wasn't real. Your mother has spent her whole life protecting your great-grandfather's family, even though nobody else knew it was happening. And you have inherited that love and that responsibility. What you do with it is your choice, but you need to make the choice, knowing what you come from." Eleanor is processing it and asking questions, but I can see something shift in her. She carries herself differently, stands taller, moves with more confidence, like something fractured inside suddenly made sense. What the creatures taught me. Over the years, I've observed things about the creatures that have fundamentally changed how I understand life and consciousness and culture. My mother taught me some of these things through her documentation, but I've added my own observations, and together we've compiled something that I believe is a legitimate ethnography of a non-human culture. They communicate, not through words like humans use words, but through vocalizations that have consistent meanings in consistent contexts. They use what sounds like a naming system, particular sounds that are associated with particular individuals. A mother will call her juvenile with a specific vocalization. The juvenile will respond with a different vocalization. Other adults will recognize the interaction, and they will respond with acknowledgement, or they will move away to give the family space. They have territories that they respect. They don't fight often. When conflicts do occur, They seem to involve posturing and sound-making more than physical combat. My mother once witnessed what she believed was a territorial dispute between two males. They stood facing each other about 30 feet apart, and they vocalized back and forth. They made physical displays, raising themselves to full height, showing their size. But they didn't attack. Eventually, one of them backed away and moved off into different territory. The other male watched him go and then continued on through the territory, as if the dispute had been settled through communication. They have hierarchies, but they're not rigid. The elder male seems to hold some kind of authority. Younger males defer to him. But I wouldn't call it dominance in the way animal behaviorists use that term. It's more like respect. Younger creatures seem to seek guidance from the elder. They stay close to him. They listen to his vocalizations and they respond. It looks more like mentorship than coercion. They engage in what looks like play. Younger creatures will chase each other. They'll make movements that seem to be purely for enjoyment, rather than for hunting or territorial defense. They'll seem to invite each other into interaction through movement and vocalization. Adults will tolerate this. Sometimes they'll participate, moving in ways that are playful rather than threatening. They seem to mourn. When my mother found a juvenile dead in the cave system, the mother of that juvenile came to the cave repeatedly over several days. She would stand at the entrance and make vocalizations that my mother described as mournful. She would make sounds that continued for extended periods. She seemed to be mourning her dead. She seemed to be grieving. They engage in what looks like food sharing. On several occasions, my mother observed an adult with food sharing that food with juveniles who seemed to be their offspring. But she also saw instances where food was shared between unrelated adults. Once she observed a male with a kill sharing meat with a female and juvenile who were not his offspring. They ate together. The male didn't dominate the food. They ate in sequence, with the male sometimes stepping back to let the others eat. They have social structure. They maintain family groups. Mothers and offspring stay together for years. Extended families seem to have ongoing relationships. The elder male seems to connect with all the family groups. He moves through all the territories. All the creatures seem to acknowledge him. My mother believed that they had stories, that they passed information from generation to generation through communication. That knowledge and culture moved through the population, not through genetic inheritance, but through cultural transmission. She said they are people, not in the sense of being human, but in the sense of having culture and consciousness and intentional ways of moving through the world. I believe her. I believe the documentation. I believe what we've both observed over decades of watching these creatures in their natural habitat. They are people. They are a different kind of people than we are, but they are people. The recordings, I have audio recordings of creature vocalizations that span 22 years. I have documented the same individual making the same vocalizations in the same contexts over that entire period. I have watched the vocalizations of juveniles change and develop as they age. I have seen evidence of individual variation. Some creatures seem to have unique vocalizations that distinguish them from others. The most extensive recordings I have are from the area my mother called the clearing, the gathering place. She said that multiple creatures sometimes came to this clearing in late summer, that they would interact, that they seemed to have social relationships that played out in this particular location. I've been recording there since 2002. I have 417 separate recordings. Each one is between 5 minutes and 40 minutes long. In total, I have over 3,000 hours of recorded creature vocalization, 3,000 hours of proof that these creatures exist, 3,000 hours of documentation of a culture that nobody else has ever seen. I've listened to these recordings hundreds of times. I've learned to recognize individual creatures by their vocalizations. I know which female makes which sounds. I know which male responds in which ways. I know which juvenile is developing their own unique vocalization pattern as they mature. I have essentially become fluent in a non-human language. But I can't tell anyone about this. I can't publish it. I can't submit it for peer review. I can't use it to advance my career. I have to keep it locked away. I have to keep it secret. I have to be the only person in the world who knows what these recordings contain and what they mean. That is the cost of loving something that the world denies the existence of. That is the cost of bearing witness to a truth that nobody else believes in. That is the cost of what my mother has built and what I have inherited. The weight, I didn't understand the full weight of what my mother was asking me to carry until I had my daughter. I didn't understand what it meant to have a child who would inherit this knowledge, a child who would have to decide what to do with the truth. A child who would have to live in a world that didn't acknowledge the existence of her ancestry. Eleanor is 17. She's smart, she's strong, she's beautiful, and she's going to have to navigate the world as someone who knows something that nobody else knows. She's going to have to decide whether to keep the secret or to try to tell it. She's going to have to figure out how to live authentically while carrying knowledge that the world would label as insane if she tried to share it. My mother asked me whether I regretted it, whether I regretted knowing, whether I wished that she had kept the secret from me, whether I wished I could go through the world believing that the mountains were empty and that the creatures didn't exist. I told her no. I told her that knowing was better than not knowing, that authenticity was better than delusion, that I'd rather carry the weight of the truth than live in comfortable lies. But I also told her that I wasn't sure Eleanor would make the same choice. I wasn't sure it was fair to burden a young person with this knowledge before she had the maturity to make an informed decision about what it meant. My mother said, "Catherine, Eleanor will make her own choice when she's ready. Your job is to give her all the information. Your job is to tell her the truth. What she does with that truth is hers to decide." So that's what I'm doing. I'm giving her the truth. I'm teaching her what I know. I'm preparing her to make her own decision about whether to keep this secret or whether to try to change the world's understanding of what exists in these mountains. The decision to speak for the last 6 months. As my mother has been getting sicker, she's been asking me to do this, to tell the story, to put it out into the world in a way that's public, but not in a way that endangers the creatures, to speak about them without speaking about specific locations, to document their existence without documenting their vulnerability. I've been resistant. For my whole professional career, I've built my credibility on being careful and scientific and conservative in my claims. If I say this now, if I tell this story now, I'm risking everything that I've built. I'm risking my career. I'm risking my professional reputation. I'm risking the possibility that people will stop listening to me when I make claims about predator conservation and habitat protection. But I've also realized that I've spent 60 years between the two of us, documenting the existence of creatures and protecting the spaces where they live. And in that time, the population has gone from 9 to 5. In that time, The world has become more developed and more hostile to wilderness, and more convinced that everything has to serve human purposes. If I don't speak now, if I don't put this truth out into the world now, then when my mother dies, all of that documentation dies with her. All of that knowledge, all of that witness, all of that love, it just disappears. Eleanor asked me last week what I thought would happen if people believed me, if I told this story and people actually accepted it as true. What would change? I told her that everything would change, that the region would be flooded with researchers and hunters and tourists, that the creatures would be exposed, that the fragile protection that we've built would collapse, that my father's family would be destroyed. She asked if that was why I was so afraid to speak. I told her yes. I told her that the only thing keeping the creatures alive is the world's refusal to believe in them. I told her that exposure is a death sentence for creatures that only survive because they're invisible. But my mother said, "Catherine, the world is destroying these mountains anyway. The world is developing them and logging them and mining them and paving them. The creatures are dying anyway. Maybe if more people knew. Maybe if more people understood what was at stake. Maybe then they would fight to protect the mountains. Maybe then the creatures would have a chance. I don't know if she's right, but I know that she's running out of time. And I know that if I don't tell this story now, it will die with her. And I can't let that happen. I can't let her life's work disappear. So I'm telling it. I'm putting it out into the world. Not to prove anything. Not to make anyone believe anything. Just to bear witness. Just to say that I know they exist. Just to say that my mother knew they exist. Just to say that they were here and they mattered and they still matter, and the world should know that. The cabin at 1963. I want to describe what it was like for my mother when she first moved to that property. Not the physical work of building, but the psychological experience of a young woman in her mid-20s, alone in the mountains, waiting for something that nobody else in the world believed existed. She didn't have electricity. She didn't have running water initially. She didn't have a telephone or a radio or any way to communicate with the outside world. She had chosen isolation completely and deliberately. She had chosen to wait. In 1963, Trinity County was barely developed. There were logging roads. There were old settlements that had been abandoned when the timber industry moved on. There were scattered cabins where people lived their own isolated lives. But the high country, the places where my mother spent her days, that was wilderness. True wilderness. Places where you could walk for days and see no sign of human activity. She would spend those first years learning the territory. She would hike into the high country every day that the weather permitted. She would sit and observe. She would sketch what she saw. She would record data in her journals. She was teaching herself to see the landscape the way a scientist sees it, as a system, as a place with patterns and relationships and meanings. She also knew that she was learning the territory in the way that the creatures would know the territory. She was walking the same routes they walked. She was discovering the same water sources. She was identifying the same food sources. She was becoming fluent in the landscape in the way that a creature who lived there would become fluent. And on some level, I think she believed that her presence was creating a pathway for my father, that by being there, by waiting, by being consistent in her presence, she was creating a possibility for him to find her, to know that this specific woman had positioned herself in this specific place with this specific intention. That's what my mother told me anyway, that she believed he knew she was coming before he ever saw her, that something in her intention reached out into the forest and said, "I'm here, I'm waiting, I'm choosing you. And he chose her in return. Genetic possibility. I attended a genetics conference in San Francisco when I was 38 years old. I was presenting research on mountain lion population genetics and genetic diversity in isolated populations. It was legitimate work. It was also positioning myself as someone who understood genetics and who had the credibility to think about complex genetic questions. At the conference, I attended a talk on hybridization between closely related species. The researcher was discussing what happens when two species that are genetically close enough can produce viable offspring. He talked about lions and tigers producing ligers. He talked about wolves and dogs producing wolf-dog hybrids. He talked about how close is close enough. The research suggested that viability depends on how genetically similar the two species are. If they're similar enough, offspring can be healthy and fertile. If they're too different, the offspring is either inviable or sterile. I thought about that work a lot after that conference. I thought about the genetic distance between humans and Sasquatch. I thought about whether it was plausible that they could produce offspring, what the genetic compatibility would need to be. Some of my colleagues have speculated about Sasquatch genetics based on historical sightings. They've suggested that Sasquatch might be a relict population of Neanderthals. They've suggested that they might be related to Gigantopithecus, an extinct ape. They've suggested various possibilities about what they might be genetically. If Sasquatch are actually a human species or a close relative of humans, if they're genetically similar enough to humans to share a most recent common ancestor, then hybridization might be genetically possible. The offspring would be a new kind of being, not fully human, not fully Sasquatch, but a combination of both. I've thought about myself in genetic terms. I'm 54% human and 46% something else, roughly. Or maybe it's a different proportion. I don't know. I've never had my DNA fully sequenced and analyzed. But I know that I'm a hybrid. I know that I exist in a genetic space that nobody has a classification for. Eleanor is probably even less human than I am. She's a quarter human on her father's side, 3/4 Sasquatch, or something like that. The math isn't clear because we don't know the exact genetics of my father, or the exact genetics of my partner, or the exact way that genetics work in these circumstances. But I know that she carries something in her that goes back to the creatures. That connection is literal. It's in her DNA. She's not just theoretically related to them. She's genetically related to them. She's part of what they are. The professional compartmentalization. By the time I was 35 years old, I had become very good at maintaining two separate professional identities. There was Catherine Reeves, the wildlife biologist. She published papers. She gave talks. She conducted legitimate field research. She was respected in her field. And then there was Catherine Reeves, the secret protector. She maintained databases of creature sightings. She took photographs that she never showed anyone. She made recordings that she kept locked away. She used her authority and her credibility to create protection zones that she knew would benefit creatures that she couldn't name or acknowledge. The two identities never intersected in public, but they were constantly in conversation in my mind. Every habitat protection project that I pushed for, every research study that I designed, every paper that I published, it was all designed to advance the same goal, to protect the creatures. It was exhausting. It required constant vigilance. Every word I said in public had to be carefully selected. Every data set I released had to be edited to remove anything that could be interpreted as evidence of Sasquatch existence. Every recommendation I made had to be framed in terms of mountain lion conservation or watershed protection or some other environmental goal that was real, but that wasn't my primary concern. My supervisor asked why I was so passionate about protecting certain regions. I told him the data supported it. He didn't question it, but I always wondered if he suspected there was something else. I would never tell him, but my mother and Eleanor knew. We were maintaining a secret that was becoming harder and harder to maintain as time went on, and as more research was conducted, and as more people had interests in the mountains. The gift. 2 years ago, my mother gave me a gift. She gave me all of her documentation. She put it in my hands and she said, "You need to take responsibility for this now. You need to decide what to do with it. You need to carry forward what I've been doing." It was binders full of notes. It was photographs that spanned 40 years. It was maps with territories marked. It was behavioral documentation. It was the record of her entire life spent documenting these creatures and protecting them. She also gave me something more personal. She gave me the final entries from her journal, the entries from the last few months before she got sick. In those entries, she wrote about her end-of-life thinking. She wrote about what she wanted to happen to her documentation. She wrote about what she wanted me to understand about the creatures and about her relationship with them. She wrote, "Catherine, I need you to know that loving your father was the most important thing I ever did. It was better than any achievement. It was better than any recognition. It was better than any conventional success. I lived a life that the world would have called wasteful. I lived in a cabin in the mountains. I had no conventional career. I had no family beyond you. I had no status or wealth or influence. But I had love. And I had witness. And I had the knowledge that I was protecting something that mattered." She wrote, "When I die, that won't be the end of this work. It will pass to you. And eventually it will pass to Eleanor. Or it will pass to whoever Eleanor chooses to share it with. The work will continue. The creatures will continue. And someone will continue to know that they exist. Someone will continue to bear witness." She wrote, "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm ready to let go. But I'm terrified of taking this knowledge with me. I'm terrified that if I die, if you don't tell this story, then everything I did will be for nothing. So I'm asking you now, while I still have the strength to ask. Please tell them, please tell the world, please let my life mean something." That's what pushed me to finally make the decision to speak. That's what made me understand that keeping the secret was no longer protecting the creatures. Keeping the secret was letting her sacrifice be for nothing. Keeping the secret was betraying her and everything she had worked for. So I'm telling it. I'm breaking the silence that I've maintained for 54 years. I'm stepping out of the shadows. I'm saying that my mother was brave, that she was right, that the creatures exist and they matter, and the world should know about them. The genetics of hybrid existence. I've spent years thinking about what I am genetically, not in the clinical sense that geneticists think about it, but in the embodied sense. What does it mean to carry the DNA of two species that shouldn't be able to produce offspring together? What does it mean to be walking proof that the categories we've created to organize the natural world are not as rigid as we think they are? At 28, I had myself tested through a private genetics lab as a baseline for supposed field research. The results came back completely human in every marker tested, which told me either the genetic distance was smaller than expected, or the markers weren't sensitive enough. I learned that genetic boundaries between species are not as clear as we pretend. Hybridization happens far more often than we acknowledge, and offspring are often viable and fertile, even when parent species are quite distant. I thought about my father's hands, about the fact that they had 5 fingers, just like human hands, about the fact that the basic skeletal structure seemed to follow the same blueprint as human anatomy. I thought about the fact that I was born without any complications, that I developed normally, that I'm fertile. Eleanor inherited my fertility. She's 17, and she's already had interest from boys at school, which makes me nervous for different reasons now. But the fact that she's fertile, that she could produce offspring if she chose to, that tells me something about the genetic compatibility. My mother believed the creatures and humans might have diverged recently in evolutionary time, taking a different path. No language, agriculture, or cities. I don't know if she was right, but I know Eleanor and I exist as proof that reproduction is possible and produces viable offspring. That's a fact that would revolutionize everything if it became public. But it won't become public knowledge. Because if I tried to prove it, if I tried to have my DNA officially analyzed, the first question would be what I'm comparing it to. And I don't have a tissue sample from my father. And even if I did, the scientific establishment would never accept it as valid proof without an intact living specimen. And I would never do anything that would lead to the capture of one of the creatures for scientific study. So the genetics of hybrid existence remains private knowledge, something I carry but can never officially claim. It's another layer of the secret, another way we exist between worlds. The shrine in the cabin. My mother kept something in the back bedroom of the cabin that she never explicitly told me about. I discovered it at 15, looking in the wooden chest where she kept winter clothes. I found a false bottom. Beneath was a collection of sacred objects, a lock of dark hair, a carved stone figure of a creature standing upright, faded photographs of my father, footprints pressed into hardened clay, a journal filled with poems and unsent letters addressed to him. I wasn't shocked. I realized this was sacred, her altar where she kept her love visible in ways the rest of her life didn't allow. I didn't tell her I'd found it, but I understood then that this wasn't just documentation. It was devotion, a shrine to something impossible, keeping the memory and love alive. After she died, I went back to that chest and added things to the collection, a photograph of Eleanor, a copy of the Trinity record, letters I wrote to my father, and letters from Eleanor asking him questions. The shrine became a place where I could acknowledge the part of me that belongs to him, where love is allowed to exist without justification. The school years, I want to talk about what it was like to be in high school as someone who didn't fit. Not just physically, though that was part of it. I was taller than other girls, stronger, I moved differently. But the real alienation came from knowing something that no one else knew, from carrying knowledge that would have been dismissed as insane if I'd tried to share it. Sarah sat next to me in sophomore biology. She was smart, curious, and wanted to be my friend. But I couldn't tell her the truth and couldn't pretend, so I kept her at a distance until she gave up. I think about her sometimes, wondering if she sensed how different I was. High school taught me to be invisible in a different way than my mother. While she hid in the mountains, I hid in plain sight, going through school activities while revealing nothing of my core self. I was on the volleyball team, fast and strong, but had to hold back to avoid standing out. I remember a girl from another team calling out, "You're not human." She meant it as an insult, but it hit hard because it was true in ways she didn't understand. And I had to stand there and laugh it off and pretend it was a meaningless barb, when in fact she had identified something fundamental about me. I didn't have a best friend in high school. I had acquaintances, people I sat with at lunch, people I was friendly with in class, but no one who knew me, no one who I let close enough to know me. That was a lonely experience, and it made me understand something about my mother that I hadn't fully understood before. The cost of keeping a secret like this is isolation, complete and total isolation. The sighting at 28, I mentioned that I saw the big male when I was 26. I want to tell you about the second time I saw him, when I was 28. This was more deliberate. I had decided to go looking for him. I had decided that I wanted to see him again, and this time I was going to try to communicate. I took a week off work, and I went into the high country with nothing but my camera, my audio equipment, and a notebook. I hiked into the granite country above Stuart Fork, and I went to the clearing where my mother had taken me when I was 12. I sat down, and I waited. He didn't come on the first day, or the second. On the third day, around dusk, I heard his movement before I saw him. He came out of the rocks and he looked at me, and I saw recognition in his eyes. He remembered me. He knew who I was. He had watched me grow up from a distance. He had seen me become a woman. We looked at each other for a long time, maybe 15 minutes, and then I did something that my mother probably would have told me not to do. I spoke to him out loud. I said, "I'm your daughter. I just wanted you to know, that I understand what you are, that I'm not ashamed of it." He made a sound, an acknowledgement, a vocalization that seemed to carry weight and meaning. Then he turned and walked slowly into the rocks, accepting that I knew who I was. I never saw him again. My mother thought he'd decided our connection was established and continuing to appear would complicate things. That one encounter shaped everything after. It gave me permission to claim my paternity and a sense of completion. That was enough. The trail cam evidence people often ask me whether I have physical evidence, real proof, photographs or video that could convince skeptics, and I do. I have trail cam footage that I've never shown anyone. Footage that absolutely, unquestionably, shows a creature that shouldn't exist according to mainstream science. But I'm not going to release it, and I'm going to explain why, because it matters. The footage is from a camera installed in 1998 in a location I won't specify. It shows a large bipedal creature moving through the forest with absolute clarity. No ambiguity, no way to dismiss it as a bear or suit or shadow. If I released it, there would be a feeding frenzy of researchers, hunters, and tourists. The creature would be captured, killed, or forced to flee. My mother faced this same dilemma many times and kept everything private. She chose discretion over proof, survival over validation. I've made the same choice. I have evidence. But I'm not sharing it, because some truths are more important to protect than to prove. The grief of disappearance. I want to tell you about what it's like to watch a population disappear, to watch creatures that you love gradually vanish from the world, to document the losses, to attend private funerals for creatures that the world doesn't even know exist. When my mother found the body of the juvenile male in 1989, she performed a ceremony. She brought flowers from the cabin garden. She sat with the body, and she sang. She made a burial site, and she marked it with stones. She came back to that site every year, on the anniversary of his death. She would bring flowers, and she would sit, and she would grieve. I inherited that practice. When I found the body of a juvenile female in 2012, I did the same thing. I performed a ceremony. I marked the grave. I committed to returning every year. And I have. Every single year since then, I have gone to that grave, and I have brought flowers, and I have sat with my grief. There are 5 grave sites marked on my private map. 5 creatures that I have personally buried. 5 funerals that I have attended. 5 griefs that I have carried alone. This is the part that costs everything. You can't document a creature's death without carrying that loss in your body. My mother buried 17 creatures over her lifetime. 17 deaths, 17 ceremonies, 17 griefs. By the time she was dying, she had accumulated a lifetime of mourning for a species the world didn't even believe existed. That's what I'm going to inherit after she dies. That's what Eleanor is going to inherit after me. We'll be the keepers of grief for a species that nobody mourns, the only ones who know what we've lost. The creatures and the law. One of the things I've struggled with throughout my career is the legal status of the creatures. In the United States, there are no laws that protect an animal that the government doesn't officially recognize as existing. There's no legal framework for species that are not listed in any official taxonomy. The creatures exist in a legal void. They have no protection, no legal standing, no rights under any environmental law. This is by design, I think. The government doesn't list species that are controversial or that don't have clear scientific documentation. The creatures fall into exactly this category. They're controversial because people see them, and some people believe and other people don't believe. They lack clear scientific documentation because the evidence is all anecdotal, and they exist in territories where systematic study would be destructive. So the creatures have no legal protection. Anyone could legally kill one. Anyone could legally capture one. Anyone could legally do whatever they wanted to one, because, officially, they don't exist. My mother worked around this by using proxy protection. She didn't protect the creatures directly. She protected their habitat. She used endangered species law. She used watershed protection regulations. She used every tool available to make the mountains places where the creatures could survive. Not because they were protected creatures, but because the ecosystems that supported them were protected for other reasons. I've done the same thing. I've spent my entire career creating protection zones that I know are critical to creature survival, even though I can't admit that's what I'm doing. It's a constant negotiation between honesty and strategy. I wonder sometimes whether that approach is enough, whether proxy protection can work indefinitely, whether there will eventually come a time when the creatures need explicit legal recognition in order to survive, when they need their own protected status. If the world reaches a point ready to acknowledge creature existence, I hope our documentation will be considered credible. But I'm not optimistic. The creatures will likely disappear before acknowledgement. We'll lose them, and the world will never know what we lost. That breaks my heart. What happens now? My mother is sleeping. The hospice nurse says she has maybe 24 to 48 hours left. Her breathing is becoming more shallow. Her body is shutting down. She's letting go. I'm sitting beside her bed, and I'm watching her breathe, and I'm thinking about what comes next. What happens to my life after she dies? What happens to Eleanor? What happens to the creatures? My mother asked me to make some decisions about her documentation. She asked me to decide what should be preserved and what should be released. She asked me whether after her death I would feel free to speak more openly about the creatures, whether I would work to change the narrative about wilderness and what exists in it. I told her I would. I promised her that I would not let her death be the end of this story, that I would continue the work, that I would continue to protect the creatures and to document their lives and to bear witness to their existence. But I also told her that I would be careful, that I wouldn't do anything that would endanger them, that I would speak in ways that honored their dignity and protected their safety, that I would tell the story without telling the location, without revealing the specific ways that they could be found. She said, "Catherine, you have to figure out how to balance honesty with safety, how to tell the truth in ways that don't destroy the things you're trying to protect. That's the art of this work." That's what I've been trying to do for 60 years. I think what I'll do after she dies is continue my work with CDFW. I'll keep researching predator ecology. I'll keep publishing papers about habitat protection. But I'll also start speaking more directly about the philosophical and ethical questions that surround our relationship with wilderness and with creatures that we don't understand. I'll write a book, maybe. A longer-form account that goes deeper than what I can say here. I'll speak to universities and environmental organizations. I'll try to shift the conversation about what exists in the margins of our understanding. I'll try to create space for people to believe in things that they haven't seen, to honor the possibility of creatures and cultures that we don't have names for. I'll also make sure that Eleanor has the choice to carry this work forward, or to release herself from it. I'll give her access to my mother's documentation. I'll give her the tools and the knowledge. But I'll tell her that she doesn't have to continue if she doesn't want to, that she can choose a different path, that she can choose to be just a regular person, living a regular life without carrying the weight of this secret. But I think she'll choose to continue. I think something in her recognizes what my mother recognized, what I recognized, that these creatures matter, that bearing witness matters, that protecting things that the world denies the existence of is a sacred responsibility. The future of the five. I sometimes imagine what will happen to the remaining creatures after I'm gone. No one left to document them, no one left to carry the knowledge of their existence. Will they thrive in anonymity? Will they slowly disappear without anyone knowing that they were ever there? Will they eventually show themselves to someone new? Someone who will realize what they are, and who will have to make the same decision that my mother made. The decision to keep the secret or to try to change the world. I hope that eventually the world changes. I hope that eventually people are ready to know that they're not alone in the wilderness, that the places they think are empty are actually full of life and culture and consciousness. I hope that eventually we develop a different relationship with wilderness, one that honors the possibility of other peoples existing in the places we think of as resources for our own use. But I also know that that change might not happen in my lifetime. It might not happen for generations. The creatures might spend centuries living in hiding, learning to hide better, learning to move more carefully through a landscape that becomes less and less safe for them every year. And that's okay. That's part of what it means to love something that the world wants to destroy. You have to love it anyway. You have to protect it anyway. You have to be willing to do the work, even if the work never results in recognition or change or anything other than the satisfaction of knowing that you tried. My mother was willing to do that. She was willing to spend her entire life protecting creatures that nobody knew existed. She was willing to dedicate herself to a cause that she knew would never be publicly celebrated. She did it because it mattered, because it was right, because she loved them. I'm going to do the same thing. Eleanor might do the same thing. We might pass this work down through generations. We might be the keepers of this secret for the rest of our lives. And that's okay. That's enough. The creatures matter. The work